Pollux stumbled for the first time, and Will clutched at the wet chestnut mane. For a moment he had almost slipped and been carried off himself. George made soothing noises, and the big horse sighed and snuffled through his nose. Will could see a few dim lights now that must come from bigger houses on the high grounds at the far end of the village. That meant they must be reaching the common, if it was still the common and not a lake. Something was changing. He blinked. The water seemed further away, harder to see. Then he realized that the light from the signs linked on his wrist was growing dim, fading away to nothing. In a moment they were in darkness. As soon as all the light had died, old George said softly, "Whoa, Polly," and the great Shire horse splashed to a halt and stood there, with the water rippling past his legs. George said, "This is where I have to leave you, Will." "Oh," Will said, forlorn. "There is the one instruction," old George said, "that you are to take the white horse to the hunter. That will happen if you fall into no trouble, and there are two bits of advice to keep you from trouble, just from me to you. The first is that you will find enough light to see by if you stand for a count of 100 after I am gone. The second is to remember what you know already, that moving water is free of magic." He patted Will comfortably on the shoulder. "Put the signs round your waist again now," he said, "and get down." It was a wet business getting down. Worse than getting up, Pollux was so high from the ground that Will splashed into the water like a falling brick. Yet he felt no cold, though the rain beat at him still. It was gentle, and in some curious way it seemed to keep him from being chilled. Old George said again, "I go to gather the hunt." And with no other word of farewell, he set Pollux splashing off again toward the common, and was gone. Will clambered up the snowbank beside the river road, found space to stand without toppling, and began counting up to 100. Before he had reached 70, he began to see what old George meant. Gradually, the dark world was taking on a glimmer of light from within itself. The rushing water, the pitted snow, the gaunt trees, he could see them all in a gray, dead light like dawn. And while he looked round, puzzling, something floating past him on the quick stream brought him such astonishment that he almost fell into the water again. He saw the antlers first, turning lazily from side to side, as if the great head were nodding to itself. Then the colors showed, the bright blue yellows and reds, just as he had seen them on Christmas morning. He could not see the details of the strange face, the bird-like eyes, the pricked ears of the wolf. But it was his carnival head, without a doubt, the inexplicable present that the old Jamaican had given Stephen to give to him, his most precious possession in the world. Will let out a noise like a sob, and leapt forward desperately to seize it before the water carried it out of reach. But he slipped as he jumped, and by the time he had recovered his balance, the bright, grotesque head was bobbing out of sight. Will began to run along the bank. It was a thing of the old ones, and from Stephen, and he had lost it. He must at all costs get it back. But memory caught him in mid-stride, and he paused. The second thing," old George had said, "is to remember that moving water is free of magic." The head was moving in water, only too clearly. So as long as it remained there, no one could harm it or use it for the wrong ends. Reluctantly, Will put it out of his mind. The great open common stretched before him, lit by a strange glimmer of its own. Nothing moved, even the cattle that normally grazed there year-round, looming up out of nowhere on misty days like solid ghosts, were away, under cover now, on the farms, driven off by the snow. Will moved on, carefully. Then the noise of the water that had been in his ears for so long began to change, growing louder, and before him the torrent filling Huntercombe Lane turned aside, joining a tiny local stream that had swollen now into a foaming river rushing over the common and away. The road that had been the river road wound on, unhindered, solid and gleaming. Old George, Will sensed, had gone that way. He would have liked to take the road too, but he felt that he was to stay with the river. Through the extra sense of the old ones, he knew that it would show him how to take the white horse to the hunter. But who was the hunter, and where was the white horse? Will went gingerly forward along the lumpy snowbank, edging the new swollen stream. Willows lined it, squat and pollarded. Then, suddenly, out of the dark line of trees on the far side of the stream, a white shape leapt. There was a glimmer of silver in the darkness that was not quite dark, and a spray of wet snow, and the great white mare of the light was standing before Will, her breath clouding round the streaks of rain. She was tall as a tree, her mane blown wild by the wind. Will touched her gently. "Will you carry me?" he said in the old speech, "as you did before?" The wind spurted as he spoke, and bright lightning flashed jagged round the edge of the sky, closer than it had been. The white horse shuddered, her head jerking up, but she relaxed again almost at once, and Will, too, felt instinctively that this brewing thunderstorm was not a storm of the dark. It was expected, it was part of what was to come. The light was rising before the dark could rise. He made sure the signs were secure on his belt, and then, as once before, he reached up to wind his fingers in the long coarse hair of the white mane. Instantly his head spun in giddiness, and clear but far off he heard the same music, bell-like and haunting, the same heart-catching phrase, till with a great jolt the world turned. The music vanished, and he was high up on the back of the white mare, high among the willow trees. Lightning was flickering all round the growing sky now. Muscles bunched in the tremendous back beneath Will, and he gripped the long mane as the horse leapt out across the common, out over the hillocks and ravines and snow, its hooves grazing the surface to leave, clung close to the mare's arched neck, that he could hear a strange, high yelping in the wind, like the sound of migrating geese flying high. The sound seemed to curve around them, and then go on ahead, dying out of range. The white horse leapt high. Will clung tighter as they rose over hedges, roads, walls, all emerging from the melting snow. Then a new noise, louder than the wind or the thunder, was in his ears, and he saw glinting, ruffled black glass ahead of them, and knew that they had come to the Thames. The river was far wider than he had ever seen it here. For more than a week it had been shut tight and narrow by icy walls of overhanging snow. Now it had broken loose, foaming and roaring, with great chunks of snow and ice tossing like icebergs. This was not a river, it was a fury of water. It hissed and howled. It was not reasonable. As he looked, Will was frightened, as he had never been by the Thames. It was as wild a thing as the dark could be, out of his knowledge or control. Yet he knew it was not of the dark, but beyond either dark or light, one of the ancient things from the beginning of time. The ancient things, fire, water, stone, wood, and then, after the beginning of men, bronze and iron, the river was loose, and would go according to its own will. "The river will come to the valley," Merriman had said. The white mare paused irresolute on the edge of the wild, cold water, then surged forward and leapt. It was only as they rose over the churning river that Will saw the island, an island where none had been before in this swollen torrent, divided by strange, glinting channels. He thought, as the white horse jolted him to earth again among bare, dark trees, "It's a hill, really. A high piece of ground cut off by the water," and suddenly he knew very clearly that he would meet great danger here. This was his place of testing, this island that was not an island. Once more he looked up into the sky and silently, desperately called for Merriman, but Merriman did not come, and no word or sign from him came into Will's mind. The storm was not breaking yet, and the wind had dropped a little. The noise of the river was louder than all else. The white mare bent her long neck, and Will scrambled awkwardly down. Through the mounded snow, sometimes ice-hard and sometimes soft enough to drop him thigh-deep, he set out to explore his strange island. He had thought it a circle, but it was shaped like an egg, its highest point at the end where the white mare stood. Trees grew round the foot. Above them was an open, snowy slope. Above that, a cap of rough scrubs dominated by a single gnarled ancient beech tree. Out of the snow, at the foot of this great tree, most perplexingly, 4 streams ran down over the hill island, dividing it into 4 quarters. The white horse stood motionless. Thunder rumbled out of the flickering sky. Will climbed to the old beech tree and stood watching the nearest spring foam out from beneath a huge snow-mounded root. And the singing began. It was wordless. It came in the wind. It was a thin, high, cold whine with no definable tune or pattern. It came from a long way off, and it was not pleasant to hear, but it held him transfixed, turning his thoughts away from their proper direction, turning them away from everything except contemplation of whatever happened to be closest at hand. Will felt he was growing roots like the tree above him. As he listened to the singing, he saw a twig on a low branch of the beech close to his hand that seemed for no reason, so totally enthralling that he could do nothing but gaze at it, as if it contained the whole world. He stared for so long, his eyes moving very gradually along the tiny twig and back again, that he felt as if several months had passed. While the high, strange singing went on in the sky from its distant beginnings, and then suddenly stopped, and he was left standing dazed with his nose almost touching a very ordinary beech twig. He knew then that the dark had its own way of putting even an old one outside of time for a space, if they needed a space for their own magic, for before him, next to the trunk of the great beech, stood Hawken. He was a more recognizable Hawken now, though still the walker in age. Will felt that he was looking at two men in one. Hawken was still dressed in his green velvet coat. It seemed still fresh, with the touch of white lace at the neck, but the figure within the coat was no longer neat and lithe. It was smaller, bent, and shrunk by age, and the face was lined and battered beneath long, wisping gray hair. The centuries that had beaten at Hawken had left only his sharp, bright eyes unchanged. Those eyes looked at Will now with cold hostility across the mounted snow. "Your sister is here," Hawken said. Will could not stop himself from glancing quickly round the island, but it was empty as before. He said coldly, "She's not here. You're not going to catch me with a silly trick like that." The eyes narrowed. "You are arrogant," Hawken hissed. "You do not see all that is to be known in the world, old one, with the gift, nor do your masters. Your sister Mary is here in this place, though she is not to be seen by you. This is a meeting for the only bargain that my lord the rider will make. Your sister for the signs. You scarcely have much choice. You people are good at risking the lives of others." The bitter old mouth curved up in a sneer. "But I do not think Will Stanton would enjoy watching his sister die." Will said, "I can't see her. I don't believe she's here." Staring at him, Hawken said in the empty air, "Master?" And at once the high, wordless singing began again, catching Will back into the slow contemplation that was warm and relaxing as the summer sun, but at the same time horrible in its soft clutch of his mind. It changed him. While he was listening, made him forget the tension of fighting for the light, submerged him this time in watching the way the shadows and hollows made patterns on a path of snow near his feet. He stood there loose and relaxed, gazing at a point where white ice, here a hollow of darkness, there, and the singing whined in his ears like a wind through the chinks of a crumbling house.